The order came through at 0347, and the man who gave it didn't look up from his coffee. That detail matters. Major Clifton Harve had been running forward operating bases for 11 years across 3 theaters, and somewhere in that time he had developed the habit of delivering critical instructions the way a contractor reviews a punch list, methodically, without sentiment, already thinking about the next item. He told the assembled team that FOB Kestrel's northern observation tower had been compromised. He told them that the enemy unit controlling the ridge above Corridor 7 had a command element embedded in a civilian transport convoy that would move at first light. He told them that the window to neutralize that element was approximately 4 minutes long, and that the only viable shot position was a concrete drainage shelf on the eastern slope, exposed, unsupported, at a distance his laser rangefinder had clocked at 640 meters. Then he finally looked up. "I need someone who can make that shot," he said. "Clean, 1 round, before the convoy reaches the blind." 12 people in that briefing room. Combat engineers, 2 medics, a signal specialist, 3 infantry veterans with tour rotations between them that stretched back to Kandahar. Every one of them went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they understand the math and don't like it. 640 meters, pre-dawn light. Moving target inside a convoy. 1 round. Harve's eyes moved around the table. He was not a cruel man. He simply needed an answer. It came from the far end of the room, from the corner where the folding chair sat slightly apart from the rest, from the woman who had been so still during the entire briefing that the corporal nearest to her had genuinely forgotten she was there. "I can make that shot," said Sergeant Fiona Adler. Nobody laughed. That would come a moment later. What they knew about Adler at that point could be assembled in roughly 40 seconds of conversation. She had been transferred to FOB Kestrel 6 weeks earlier from a support coordination unit that nobody at the base could quite locate on an org chart. She was 31 years old. She had a degree in applied mathematics from the University of Waterloo that she had completed while simultaneously enrolled in the reserves, a combination so unusual that her commanding officer at the time had flagged it twice in her file. Not as a concern, but because he didn't know which box to put it in. She was quiet. She took her meals at irregular hours. She had a tendency to sit at angles to rooms rather than facing them squarely, which made people feel, without being able to say exactly why, that she was always watching more than one thing. What they did not know, what nobody at FOB Kestrel had thought to look for, was that Fiona Adler had spent 3 years before her transfer assigned to a cold-range evaluation program in Wainwright, Alberta, helping to develop and test long-range sniper qualification standards for the Canadian Armed Forces. She had not done this as an instructor. She had done it as a test subject. She was, in the formal language of the program's final report, a statistical outlier in both first-round hit probability and win correction calculation at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The report was filed. The program wrapped. Adler was transferred to support coordination because the program director had retired and nobody had read the report carefully enough to understand what they had. She had not mentioned this at FOB Kestrel because nobody had asked. The laughter, when it came, was not mean-spirited. That distinction matters. The men in that room were not bad people. They were tired people, operating in a context where trust was built through visible experience, patrols you'd shared, contact you'd survived together, stories you could verify. Adler had shared none of those things with them. She appeared to every person in that room to be a support staffer with a mathematics degree who had just volunteered for something that experienced operators approached with serious caution. Warrant Officer Bevan Croft, who had 17 confirmed long-range engagements across 2 deployments, didn't quite laugh. He made a sound. It was a very short sound that communicated a complete position without requiring any words. Harve did not make that sound. He looked at Adler for a long moment. "What's your background?" he said. She told him. The room went through an adjustment. You could watch it happen, the slight recalibrations of posture, the expressions that shifted without anyone deciding to shift them. Croft's face did something complicated. "Wainwright's a controlled range," he said. "This is not a controlled range." "No," said Adler. "The drainage shelf gives me a natural windbreak on the left shoulder. The convoy will be decelerating at the curve. I've looked at the satellite imagery, which gives me approximately 8 seconds of reduced variable, not 4. The target vehicle has a distinctive antenna configuration on the roof. I can identify it in low light. Harv put down his coffee. How do you know about the antenna configuration? He said. I've been reviewing the surveillance footage since Tuesday, she said. I asked Corporal Renault for access. He said yes. Croft looked at Renault. Renault, who was 23 years old and had processed the access request as routine administration, looked as though he was reconsidering several decisions. Harv was quiet for 4 seconds. In a briefing room, 4 seconds is a long time. All right, he said. You've got it. She moved into position at 0519, 41 minutes before first light. This is worth pausing on because the decision to arrive 41 minutes early was not ordered, not suggested, and not discussed. It was a calculation Adler had made privately, working backward from the light conditions she expected at the moment of the shot, factoring in the time her eyes would need to fully adapt to the specific darkness of that slope, accounting for the fact that the drainage shelf had an irregular surface she had only seen in photographs and would need to map with her hands before she could trust her body position. She carried the rifle, a bipod, a spotting monocular, and a small notebook in which she had written, in pencil, the ballistic data for 4 different wind scenarios. She did not bring a radio earpiece. She had learned, over years of quiet range work, that other people's voices in her ear changed the quality of her attention in ways she couldn't afford. She would check in by signal light at designated intervals. If she didn't check in, they would know something had gone wrong. The shelf was worse than the photograph suggested. The concrete had cracked along a frost line, and there was a 10-centimeter elevation difference between the left and right sides of her position. She spent 11 minutes adjusting, testing, lying flat, and feeling exactly where her body wanted to go and where it would resist. She found the angle. She confirmed it twice. Then she lay still and waited. Experienced shooters talk about waiting as though it is the passive part of the task. It is not. Waiting, at distance, in darkness, with a target that will appear at a specific time, in a specific place and require a specific response, is one of the most cognitively demanding things a human body can do. The mind wants to rehearse. It wants to pre-experience the shot, to run through the motions so many times that the actual event becomes a confirmation rather than an action. Adler had spent years learning to manage that impulse, not to suppress it, but to use it. She let herself rehearse twice. Exactly twice. Then she put the rehearsal away and simply existed in the position. Breathing slowly, feeling the cold concrete through her jacket, listening to the sounds of the valley below. There were birds. She had not expected birds at that hour, but there they were. Some kind of thrush, she thought, working the lower brush line. She registered them and let them go. At 0558, 12 minutes before expected convoy movement, her radio crackled with a single click. Confirmation. The convoy had been sighted at the lower checkpoint. She put her eye to the monocular. The convoy was 7 vehicles. This was 2 more than the intelligence estimate had suggested, and the addition of 2 vehicles changed the geometry of the problem in ways that were not immediately obvious. What it changed specifically was the visual sequence she would use to identify the command vehicle. Her original plan had relied on a relative position, 3rd vehicle, antenna configuration visible by silhouette. With 2 additional vehicles inserted somewhere in the line, that positional marker was potentially invalid. She needed to find the antenna configuration directly, which meant scanning across a moving column in degraded light and identifying a specific visual signature among vehicles that, at 640 meters in pre-dawn gray, were going to be difficult to distinguish. She did not panic. That's not a moral statement about her character. It's a description of a neurological condition she had spent years cultivating. Panic, for a long-range shooter in an evolving situation, is simply information arriving faster than it can be processed. The solution is not to stop the information, but to slow the processing demand, to reduce the number of active variables and handle them in sequence rather than simultaneously. She identified the antenna. 4th vehicle. The antenna configuration was distinctive. A primary vertical with 2 lateral extensions at unequal angles. The result, She had surmised from the surveillance footage of field repair after damage. It was not a standard military configuration. It was a specific improvised one, and at 640 meters in the gray light before dawn, she could see it. The convoy was decelerating. The curve was coming. She had calculated 10 seconds. She was going to get closer to 6. This is the part of the story that people who were not there tend to want to compress into a single moment, a held breath, a trigger pull, a result. But that compression is dishonest, because what happened in those 6 seconds was not a single moment. It was a sequence of adjustments, each one feeding the next, each one happening fast enough that they did not feel like decisions so much as corrections. She tracked the vehicle. She confirmed the angle. She registered a shift in the crosswind, small, not in her 4 scenarios, requiring an interpolation. She performed. Without fully forming the conscious thought, she found the stillness inside the motion. She placed the reticle. She fired once. The signal light came back within 90 seconds. She had at that point already begun the process of extracting from the position. Not because she knew the result, she wouldn't know the result until the signal came, but because the position had been occupied for over 30 minutes, and occupying a position for that long in a forward environment carried its own risk calculus. And she had already decided that the extraction timeline would not change regardless of the outcome. The signal came as she was 3/4 of the way back up the slope. She stopped. Read it. Continued climbing. Back at the base, the atmosphere was the particular kind that happens when a group of people who were collectively skeptical have been collectively proven wrong. It is an uncomfortable atmosphere. People handle it in different ways. Some handle it by being effusive, overcorrecting into enthusiasm in a way that, if you're paying attention, reveals the size of the doubt it's replacing. Some handle it by becoming very interested in logistics and documentation, finding tasks that need doing, ways to be useful that keep them from having to stand in the room and rearrange their understanding of someone they had misread. Croft handled it by walking directly up to Adler in the equipment staging area and standing in front of her until she looked up from what she was doing. "That was a hell of a shot," he said. He said it the way you say something when you mean it and you're not going to say anything else. Adler looked at him for a moment. "The wind shifted," she said. "I had to interpolate." Croft nodded slowly. "What did you get?" "About 1.5 meters of correction, maybe a bit more." He did the math in his head. She watched him do it, watched the number land. "In 6 seconds, he said. "More like 5.5, she said. "The deceleration was faster than I expected." Croft was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a brief at 1400 about Corridor 9. I'd like you there." It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was an acknowledgement offered in the only currency that meant anything in that environment, the currency of being taken seriously. Adler said yes. There is a version of this story that ends there, with the shot, with the corridor, with the team's recalibration. But the true shape of this story has a longer arc, one that doesn't close with a single morning on a hillside in a cold October dawn. What Harv did 2 days after the engagement was write a report. This was routine. All engagements required after-action documentation. What was not routine was what he included in the addendum, which was a detailed account of Adler's prior service record, the cold range evaluation program, and what he called, in his characteristically understated prose, a recommendation for formal review of this soldier's placement and utilization within the operational structure. He also, and this was the part that mattered, CC'd the report to the Wainwright program's former director, who had by then retired to a teaching position in Kingston, and who, upon reading it, forwarded it to 3 people on the active duty side of the institutional fence, with a message that contained, in its entirety, the words, "I told you to read the file." The review took 4 months. Adler was not informed of it while it was happening. She continued her work at Fob Kestrel, the briefings with Croft, the corridor assessments, the occasional long-range evaluation that had begun, with no formal announcement, to simply become part of her regular assignment. She took her meals at irregular hours. She sat at angles to rooms. She watched more than one thing. The review concluded in February. The result was a formal reclassification of her role, a designation that, in the bureaucratic language of the document, amounted to recognition of capabilities that had been present and documented for 3 years before anyone in the operational chain had looked for them. She got a letter. It was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph thanked her for her service. She read it once, folded it, put it in her notebook beside the page with the 4 ballistic scenarios. The pencil marks were still there. The calculations she'd made in the dark, in the cold, for a 6-second window in a gray Alberta dawn. She didn't erase them. They were correct. The question that sometimes surfaces when people discuss cases like Adler's is a question about the system rather than the individual. How does something like this happen? How does a quantifiably exceptional capability sit unrecognized for 3 years in a file that exists precisely to document it? The honest answer is that the military, like every large institution, is better at processing what it expects than at discovering what it didn't anticipate. The evaluation program that produced Adler's file was designed to test candidates against a standard. It was not designed to create a protocol for what to do when a candidate substantially exceeded that standard in ways that didn't correspond to a pre-existing role. The program director had tried to flag it. His flag was read as administrative enthusiasm. He retired. The file sat. This is not a story about malice. It is a story about attention, about the specific kind of institutional blindness that comes from looking at people in categories rather than looking at them directly. Adler was a support coordinator. Support coordinators were not long-range shooters. The math was simple, and it was wrong for 3 years before a tired major in a forward operating base asked an open question to a full room and happened to hear the answer. That's a small thing. An open question. A room that included everyone. It's worth thinking about how many rooms don't. She was in Corridor 9 when the second situation developed. This was 6 weeks after the first engagement, in conditions that were, if anything, worse. Low cloud, the specific flat gray light that eliminates contrast and makes distance judgment unreliable, and a position that offered half the natural windbreak of the drainage shelf. The target in this case was not a moving vehicle. It was a communications relay that had been established overnight in a decommissioned grain storage structure at the edge of an agricultural easement, and the problem was not the range. Well within comfortable parameters, but the angle, which required a shot through a gap in the structure's corrugated roof that measured, at the wide end, less than 30 centimeters. Croft was on the radio this time. He had asked to be. "Talk me through it," he said. "I'm looking at a 30-centimeter gap at 480, she said. "The relay unit is positioned at the north wall. I've got a ricochet risk off the interior east wall if I'm off by more than 2 degrees. What's your confidence?" She was quiet for a moment. "High, not absolute. What's the consequence of a miss?" "Relay stays up for another 6 to 8 hours. They move the convoy. We lose the window and a ricochet, controlled space. No civilian presence, risk to the relay itself." Croft was quiet. "Your call," he said. This was the part she hadn't expected, not the shot, but the permission, the specific act of being handed the decision. She had spent her career in systems where decisions moved upward and downward through established chains, where the person closest to the problem was often the last person consulted about it. Croft saying your call was, in its small way, an act of institutional faith that she didn't have a ready framework for. She put her eye back to the scope. The gap in the roof was 30 centimeters at the wide end. It was positioned at an angle that caught the available light in a way that actually made it easier to resolve than she'd expected. The relay unit's housing was a standard gray-green composite, not military issue, but recognizable. It was sitting on a crate at approximately 1.2 meters from the floor, which gave her a shooting line that cleared the south wall threshold with 11 centimeters of margin. 11 centimeters at 480 meters with flat gray light and a degraded windbreak. She made the calculation. She made it again. The 2 answers were the same. She fired. The relay went down at 11:34. The convoy window held. Croft didn't say anything when she checked back in. He clicked the radio twice, confirmation, and then after a pause that she had come to recognize as the particular silence of someone composing a thought carefully, he said, "How's your coffee situation?" She said she was out. "I'll have someone meet you at the slope base with a thermos," he said. "Dark, no sugar." I'm guessing. Yes, she said. How did you know that? Because I've never seen you take anything from the communal supplies that wasn't strictly necessary, he said. Sugar is not strictly necessary. She was still for a moment on the slope in the flat gray light, thermos presumably incoming. That's a very precise observation, she said. I've been paying attention, he said. Someone should have sooner. The thermos was waiting at the slope base. She drank the coffee standing up, looking back at the agricultural easement in the middle distance, at the gray roof with its irregular gap, at the ordinary landscape of a place where something extraordinary had just been done very quietly. The thrushes were back. Same brush line, more or less. She stood and listened to them for a moment before she started back up. She had a briefing at 1400. She didn't want to be late.